It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce my friend Saad. And many of you will have come along knowing who Saad is, but for those of you who don't, he is somebody who you should know much more about. I first met Saad, I guess, probably 15, 20 years ago in Afghanistan. He is somebody who had the most extraordinary life growing up, which we'll touch on a little bit. He's almost the most sort of definitionally cosmopolitan person imaginable. He then came back to Afghanistan and founded what became the most interesting free media story in Afghanistan and sustained it right the way through and into the Taliban period. And in the course of that life, he also became involved in Iran, in Ethiopia, got to know almost everybody in American and international politics. And also, as you will discover, has a very fine sense of humor. So be prepared for the ride. And thank you, Saad, for coming.
Thank you.
So, Saad, can we begin, for people who don't know you very well, just to give us a sense of your family, your father, where you grew up, how your family moved in your early years?
Thank you. Well, I was born in London 58 years ago at St. George's Hospital on St. George's Day, which is now the, what's the name of the hotel?
The Langham Hotel.
That's it. And then I lived in various places, and my parents actually drove from London to Kabul in 1969. I had my third birthday in Damascus. How much things have changed. And then we lived in Pakistan, Tokyo, Australia.
And just give us a sense of your parents. So your parents were Afghan?
Yes.
And your father was a diplomat?
Yes, correct.
And what sort of family did they come from? Did they come from the city? Did they come from the countryside? What did your grandparents done? What was that whole story?
My father's family, they were traders. And as a matter of fact, my great-grandfather was the first person to export Afghan karakul or Central Asian karakul to Europe. And his
Which
name
is
was
a type of lamb.
That's
a type
correct,
of lamb
yes.
Yeah.
So his name was Abdulaziz. Oh, that's my great-uncle, but he was known as Abdulaziz al-Landani because he'd been in London, I think in the early 1900s. And my father joined the Foreign Service, and he was posted when Eisenhower was the president. He was born in 1926. Both you and I had much older fathers. And my mom was from a sort of, her parents were landlords and bureaucrats. And well, in London, she worked for the BBC when I was born. So my parents were sort of well-educated, middle-class Afghans.
And that 1969, so my sister drove from London to Kabul in 1972, and my mother did it in 1962. But generally in people's minds, this was associated with a hippie trail by the late 60s, but your parents, paradoxically, were actually Afghans doing the same journey.
Yeah, I think they had a car full of for everything. I mean, as a matter of fact, I recall as a 12-year-old, my parents had this big suitcase of pharmaceuticals, of aspirin and things like that they'd bought in London. And 9 years on, we were still going to the suitcase for quick remedies in terms of headaches and so forth. But yeah, I think it was an adventure, but also it allowed them to bring back a lot of furniture and things. And but it was just an easy trip for most people. Our friend, mutual friend Tom Freston, who's written a book about it, and I read the Afghan chapter. It was a wonderful period. Everything was stable. I mean, it's hard to believe today.
So you returned. You were a small boy. You returned to Kabul, a much, much smaller Kabul, at a time which was about to transition from a monarchy to a nationalist government. We're now in the 1970s. Give us a bit of a sense of the culture of Kabul at the time and what you saw of it and remember of it as a child.
I mean, Kabul is a wonderful city. It's a bit like you'd find in Aspen or in Colorado. It's 2,000 meters above sea. It's surrounded by hills, probably not as green as Aspen, but nonetheless, in those days, it had a population of about 300,000 people. Today, it has a population of 7.5 million people, or at least Greater Kabul has. So it had a sort of a very, there was a middle class emerging. Literacy rates were low. The country hadn't developed at all, actually, relative to today. But in some ways, it was very organic, what was happening in the country. And then in 1972, there was a coup d'etat, and the king was replaced by his first cousin with the help of leftist in the military. And in 1978, there was another coup d'etat, and this is when the leftists took power for themselves.
And remind us, how old was the young Saad at this time? Where were you living? How did this all inflict with your own personal life?
In 1972, I was in Pakistan because my father served at the embassy in Pakistan. In 1978, I was in Kabul. As a matter of fact, my school, the Lycée Istiqlal, if you recall, was right next to the presidential palace. So on the day of the coup, it was a Thursday. It was meant to be my birthday.
And you were how old then? 78?
I had just turned 12, actually. 12 and 3 days or something. But because it was a weekend, they were going to celebrate my birthday. And then we heard gunfire, and then there was this, this panic. I mean, Afghanistan, no one was used to violence in those days. It's hard to believe. So we all scrambled out, and of course, I went to look for my mom, and we got caught in a sort of a mini battle by the finance ministry. Somehow I got home, and it was actually quite a traumatizing experience for a 12-year-old, like columns of tanks going from outside the city in Qarqa, which is a lake by the city, into the city, and then jets flying over the palace. And the next day, President Dawood had been executed, and many members of his family, including a lot of my friends, actually, who were members of the royal family, or at least members of Dawood's family. And then there was a sort of a purge, but luckily my father had already been posted to Tokyo. So we quickly packed up, and within a few weeks we were in Japan.
And when you say traumatizing, I mean, is it something that stayed with you for some years, this experience?
Of course it stays with you. I mean, of course, looking at today and what's going on in Palestine, or even in Afghanistan over the last 40-odd years, it's nothing. I mean, you see some people get killed, but at that time, for me, not ever experienced any violence of that sort was pretty scary. But it shakes up the foundation, because Afghanistan was safe, and we're going to always live there. But to see that sort of crumble, and I think you have this feeling that things are not going to be the same as a child. And leaving Afghanistan, I realized that it would be a long time before I returned to the country. And this is before the Russians invaded, by the way.
Yeah. So this just to bring the audience in for a second, I mean, this is something that maybe, and I'm going to come back to Saad on this and just talk for a minute or two about this. We often forget in dealing with countries like Afghanistan, or indeed with Lebanon, we imagine that they've been in centuries of violence. And we forget that, in fact, the experience is often a very, very long period of peace. In the case of Lebanon, you could even say 700-800 years of peace before things collapsed in the civil war in the 80s. And again, what Saad's pointing to here is that when we think about Afghanistan now, we think Taliban, we think civil war, we think the CIA funding resistance to the Russian occupation. We maybe even think about the First and Second Anglo-Afghan Wars, but what we forget is the Second Anglo-Afghan War was in 1879. It was 100 years before the events that Saad is describing. And in that 100 years between, of course, the experience of somebody living there is of living in peace, particularly of a 12-year-old. And I suppose what I'm going to come back to Saad on here is, as we look at our own world, where suddenly events happen in the United States that make people think, well, I wasn't really expecting this, or we have to transition from a world that many of us grew up in, I guess, in the 90s, which was a world that felt as though every year it was becoming more peaceful, more prosperous, fewer people living in poverty, fewer refugees, and what it means now to be in a world that's going dramatically in the other direction. I think examples like Saad's are real examples of the fact that our societies are much more fragile than we acknowledge, and 100 years of apparent peace and security can crumble. So I'm going to come back to you on that. I mean, since then, you've worked in many, many places. You've worked in Afghanistan again, you've worked in Iran, you've worked with Ethiopia, you've traveled all over the world. What do you think about this question of stability, fragility, and what do you think that those of us in this audience who've tended to grow up in the relative comfort of the West, what are we missing about the experience of so many people in other parts of the world?
I think you can't take anything for granted. You know, and if you look at the history, yes, there are periods of stability, but things can change very, very quickly. But I think, you know, our nature, we are attracted to conflict, I think. And the machismo, and especially now with what we're witnessing in the US, you got to be careful. I think that this sort of saber rattling, this return of the uneducated man in the U.S. in some ways should be cause for alarm. I think. I mean, hopefully it'll pass, but you have to be careful, because I think that we've worked in places like India and Pakistan, across the Middle East, and Iran and Ethiopia and so forth, and Ethiopia as well. I mean, we saw the way that country, relatively peaceful, and how things changed so quickly. And that's why you need institutions, and that's why you need people to be very, very vigilant, and how quickly things can change. In Afghanistan, we hadn't, even the Second Anglo-Afghan War, it was a number of battles between the Brits and the Afghans. The country wasn't, we weren't killing each other. We pushed back the British invaders. And then the Third Anglo-Afghan War was very brief. So Afghanistan hadn't seen any sort of conflict for centuries, perhaps, one could argue.
So let's fast forward to the subject of your book. And I'd like to, again, recommend Saad's book, which is why this event is happening. Tell us a little bit about that story and what the core story of the book is, and about what you did in Afghanistan when you returned as an adult much later after the fall of the Taliban government.
Well, we went back, like a lot of Afghans, to have a look for ourselves as to what can we do for this country.
So this is after 9/11. This is 2002, I guess. Yeah.
By us, I mean my brothers, my brothers and my sister, the four Mohseni siblings. And it was exciting to be back. We hadn't been back since 1978. This was in 2002, and we met with the newly appointed officials like Ashraf Ghani and Hamid Karzai, the president, and many others, and they all encouraged us, you should come back. And we thought we should invest in a number of sectors, like a fund. And we got a small grant to set up a radio station, which we did. And it was so controversial that it pretty much sucked us all into the country, because we were dealing with warlords, we were dealing with the government, we're dealing with people protesting outside our offices.
And what was the concept of the radio station?
It was like an FM radio station in the UK. Music, chit-chat, news, weather, traffic.
And why was it controversial? Why are people protesting?
Because we had music, we had male and female DJs. It was fun. I mean, there are people who are enemies of fun in a country like Afghanistan, and we had to contend with them. But it was pretty innocent fun, and it wasn't rocket science. This would appeal to people. And within a couple of weeks, we didn't even launch the station officially. It was the most popular radio station, blaring in every shop you went past, every taxi, every vehicle. And all of a sudden, we were proprietors of this very small radio station, quite controversial. And then that experience allowed us to get into television and second television station, and then we went outside the country and we went to all these other countries. So I tell the story of this media operation inside of Afghanistan, and I tell it through the different characters that worked for us, from the tea guy to my mom to the guy who came back and set up the football league, or the first sort of famous female film director, juxtaposed with what was going on politically in that period.
I mean, tell us a little bit about your mum.
Well, my mum, she was in London, and when I was born, and she worked for the BBC, and she was very sort of entrepreneurial in her own way. She worked for the UN for a long time, and she was a school teacher in Japan at an international school, and then when we went back to Australia, she really was the rock of the family. Whereas my father was, as a former diplomat, he had difficulties finding work. My mom was quite entrepreneurial. She had her own business and so forth. But she was also very sort of encouraged all of us to do our own thing, and she always sort of gave us a lot of confidence. Even today, she's 80, and she spends most of her time in Kabul. She is the sort of the consigliere to the CEO and helps the women in the office, and goes to the office every single day, works in the office 10 hours a day, and just is, generally speaking, sort of a pain to the people who run the operation because she gets involved in every single thing that's going on. But she's a very strong lady, and if you get the book, you'll read about her.
And tell us a little bit about that, because this is Taliban Afghanistan, and they have been issuing. Oh, well, I mean, let me just sort of, for people who aren't following Afghanistan very closely, the story basically here is that 9/11 happens, the US invasion happens at the end of 2001, and Saad is describing turning up in 2002. Taliban government is toppled very, very quickly. New government comes in. And for the first 2-3 years, it seems to be pretty calm and quiet, and then gradually an insurgency begins to develop momentum, particularly in the south and the east, and the Taliban, which had largely disappeared, comes back. And then finally, I guess 3 years ago now, we have a withdrawal from Afghanistan where Biden takes the last few troops out. And quite literally, having spent 20 years in the country and spent, 1,000 billion US dollars, hands the country back to the Taliban again. A new Taliban takes over, and the first Taliban that Saad was looking at the consequences of when he returned in 2002 were unbelievably aggressive in a whole series of ways. They were very aggressive towards the Shia community, which is another Muslim community, particularly in central mountains of Afghanistan and around Bamiyan. They hung televisions from trees. They conducted public executions in the National Stadium. They come back again, and there's talk about the new Taliban being a bit different, and lots of sort of smart people in Washington think tanks, because the main industry that's developed over 25 years is Washington think tanks with expertise on Afghanistan begin creating very complicated charts about how there are actually 3 different parts of the Taliban and this, that, and the other come in. And now we're looking at what this government is really like. They issue decrees from Kandahar saying, can women talk to each other on the streets? Can women stay in education? Can women go to work? What kind of work can they go to, etc.? And the question to Saad is, what does this mean practically? So what has this meant for you running your businesses in Afghanistan? What was it like straight after the Taliban takeover? What's it like today?
You're good at this, Rory. I think you've done this before. I was enjoying your story. Please continue. So it's, I keep on saying that the movement is not a monolithic movement. They have different points of view, and they try very hard to remain united and to give the impression that it's one movement and one ideology and one policy. But in fact, it's a lot more fragmented in terms of the way that they perceive and view things. So some of the decrees coming from Kandahar, because ultimately the leader of the faithful, the man sitting in Kandahar, who's only been to Kabul twice, we've never seen his face. We've heard his speeches, but no one's met him. I think of the world leaders, only 2 have met him, the Qataris and the Uzbeks. So this man keeps on issuing decrees, but when it comes to Kabul, in terms of implementation, there's hesitancy, in particular when it relates to women and media. In terms of education, yes, it was fully implemented. Girls beyond the 6th grade cannot go to school, although they turn a blind eye to, certain institutions and secret schools and so forth. But generally speaking, schools have closed down beyond the 6th grade. But in terms of everything else, there is some resistance in Kabul. The question is, something has to give. The pragmatists are running the country. You've been to Kabul. You've seen things for yourself. Women can drive still. They work at the airport. They stamp your passport. You see them walking on the street without covering their faces. Probably not as many women as pre-August of 2021. Nonetheless, you see them. You see them in Mazar. You see them in Kabul. You see them in Herat, in the major cities. But in reality, this is sort of this tug of war is becoming more and more serious. And at some stage, something has to give. Either the pragmatists have to actually go and start implementing what the decrees are being issued out of Kandahar, or they have to replace the leader, because this cannot last indefinitely. And one of the reasons I'm advocating for engagement is that they need to engage with these pragmatic leaders in Kabul. because there is an opportunity and there is a path.
Yeah, I mean, I was there, I guess, last probably 8-9 weeks ago, and one of the things that struck me walking with a Taliban minister around an office was firstly just how many armed men he had with him, but secondly, that when we saw women, there wasn't really much interaction with them, and I couldn't quite tell whether it was that they sort of acknowledged that there were women there but didn't really want to focus on it because they were worried what that meant in terms of decrease. I mean, how does it work with your mother and the women working in your office? Do they have to be in a separate bit of the office? Do the Taliban turn up and investigate? What?
Yeah, they show up sometimes to check things out. They're supposed to be in segregated areas, but they mix.
Right.
And of course, the Taliban have their spies and so forth, but they sort of, their approach, which is very much laissez-faire, allows us to continue operating. And, we have women on, in front of the camera, behind the camera, they're on the field, they're reporting from across the country, perhaps not from small villages, but certainly from the major cities. They cannot be on stage. I mean, this is the weird thing. In a studio, sitting like this, we cannot have a man and a woman sitting next to each other, but we can have two women, conducting an interview or discussing an issue. So it's weird, but so far we're continuing with our operations. There's still media. It could be worse. That's my thinking. But I don't take anything for granted. This all could end tomorrow, by the way.
And how does this work? So you have an authoritarian regime with incredible power, with a very, very conservative religious outlook, and you are running a media network which was liberal, progressive, outspoken, critical of even the democratically elected government. So does that mean you have to watch your words? You can't be too rude about the Taliban? I mean, how does this work? Do you have to change the whole way that you manage? And
yeah, I mean, as a matter of fact, a friend of ours, Nick McDonald, I don't know if you know Nick, but he met the Taliban in 2020. And he asked him, he said, what's the first thing we're going to do? He said, we're going to shut down Tullow TV. And we have this format called Afghan Idol, which is our sort of, Afghan Star, which is the Idol format. Although we've stopped that program, but everything else continues. So we have news operations. It's probably not 100% of what it was. It's probably 90 or 95%, and we have to. There's no story we cannot cover. Perhaps we don't cover them with as much fanfare as before, and have roundtables and grill everyone. But we cover stories, whether it's human rights abuses by the Taliban, alleged, say, from the UN, or we've done over 2,000 stories on girls' education and why the ban should be lifted. And it's not that we interview people from the West. We interview people from within the Taliban who advocate for girls' education, for example. So we have to be smart about that. Now, we can't go and criticize the leader in the way that we would like to. That's probably one of the sort of red lines for us. But other than that, our presence, I think, is important because we inform the Afghan public, but we also educate people. So I think last year we did 700 hours of educational programs working with UNICEF. So we do mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology for grades 7, 8, and 9. And we're going to double that going all the way through high school. And the indications are it's having a huge impact in terms of learning, especially for young girls who can't go to school. So we do education programs. We still do entertainment programs. No music or no soap operas, but we had chat shows. We have, game shows, comedy, cooking, travel, and so forth. But the business is very much ring-fenced, and we have to be very careful. I mean, for us, we're always, a minute away from leaving the country and setting up somewhere outside. But so far, I think it's important for us to be there because we're also informing people outside of what's going on inside the country, because we still have 100 reporters throughout the country reporting on what's going on inside the country.
I mean, this again is a theme, and we'll open up to the audience pretty soon to bring you in. But this question of the relationship between media and governments obviously matters in Britain, matters in the US, it matters in Afghanistan, and there's a huge spectrum. There's the issues about how the New York Times covers Trump and Biden. There's the issue of the control of newspapers and ownership here in Britain. there's the grey zones of what's happening to the media in Viktor Orban's Hungary or Narendra Modi's India or Erdogan's Turkey. There's the slightly less grey zone of what's happening to the media in Russia or Iran. There's the perplexities about how you cover stories if you're a Chinese journalist. So I'm going to get back to Saad on this before I sort of start moving on to questions. What is this? What have you learnt about all these different stories when you look at media coverage in all those other countries about how this works? And do you see hypocrisies and strangenesses? Is there more space to do coverage in Iran, Russia, and China than we think, and less space in the United States than we think? I mean, how does this all work?
Well, I think there's space everywhere, actually. America's never been more fragmented because, we've invested in this podcasting business, as you know, so we watch that market very carefully. But if you look at the numbers, they're terrible, even before the elections. For example, the average viewership of CNN is like 800,000 people. MSNBC is like 1.2 million. And even Fox News, their top show doesn't generate more than like 4.5
And to put that in
million.
context, 700,000 is what I'm getting on my podcast.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, that's because you're Rory Stewart. And Joe Rogan gets on average 15 to 20 million downloads or listeners for each per episode. So old media, as someone calls them, corporate media, mainstream media, is it dead? I mean, maybe not, but it's certainly dying.
And the revenue stream has gone in a very strange direction. Yeah? Is that right?
Well, because most of these people, there are 70 million, there used to be 70 million households, right? They're not all watching television at the same time, but they'll pay that extra $5 to get Fox News or, $7 to get CNN. So as a result, they were generating huge sums of money, but their viewership numbers have been shrinking for the last 5, 6, 7 years, quite dramatically. And the market's a lot more fragmented. The issue in America or in the Western world is that, we don't go, we go to have our views reinforced, right? We're all in our own bubbles. And it's not like the 50s and 60s or in the UK up until 30 years ago, where you had the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 and so forth. You had 3 networks. In America, you had 3 until Fox showed up. So we had 4 networks. So, for example, NBC News in the 1980s would generate 25, 30 million viewers. No one generates those sorts of viewership today. So there's both an opportunity, but it also shows that it's a far more fragmented audience, which is also dangerous, I think, for a country in terms of social cohesion.
So that brings us on to the final question from me before I bring in the questions from everyone else, which is, how does this contribute to what we've just seen in the US election? What are your thoughts about the US election?
Well, I was in the US just before the elections, and I was waking up every morning watching Fox News, Morning Joe, and CNN. And I just couldn't figure out why the sort of liberal media's, insistence that Kamala Harris would prevail. I just couldn't see how that would happen, given all the conversations I was having with people in New York City, not in Minnesota or Wisconsin or other places. And I think they've lost a lot of credibility in the process. In some ways, they deceived their audiences. But you could see, the system is obviously, the process, I wouldn't say it's broken, but it needs fixing. The average, Congress's approval ratings at 13%. Right? Can it get any lower than that? So people they don't have faith in the political establishment. They don't have faith in the institutions. And I think they want to break things. It's a bit like Brexit. They want to punish the establishment by bringing Trump in. I think there's going to be buyer's remorse, no doubt. The question is how soon. Will it be, will it be before the elections, or will they wait till after the elections? And certainly, we talked about this before. Some of the policies that they're going to pursue, it's not going to be that easy to deliver peace in the Ukraine in 24 hours. Is that what he said? Is that what he promised?
24 hours,
okay.
Yeah, 24 hours. We're done in 24 hours, yeah. Well, guys, listen, I'm going to open up to you. We can go in any direction. I've only touched the surface of Saad's book, his work in media in Kabul, his experience of Afghanistan, but he's also a guy who literally knows Rupert Murdoch, knows Steve Bannon, has met pretty much half the heroes and villains of the world. So do please come in from any direction. I think he's promised to be frank and funny and outspoken, and let's see who's brave enough to put a hand up. If not, I will keep. Yeah, right. Please. Come.
Have we got a?
Yeah. Here's mic coming. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about. You say that the media coverage is changing. How is it changing? Is it internet access? Is it social media? Yeah, in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan, internet access is still pretty low. I think it's about 10 million people in a country of 42 odd million individuals, but it's going to pick up very quickly. Affordability is also an issue because the economy has shrunk quite a bit since 2021. But people have satellite dishes now. You know, in the old days, you'd have to spend $150, $200 to get a satellite dish and a set-top box. Now you can get the package for $30, if not less. So a combination of internet, satellite television, but also people exchange stories via TikTok and WhatsApp. So and the median age in Afghanistan is 18. It's the youngest country outside of sub-Saharan Africa, and its population is growing at 3% per annum. So you're dealing with a very young population that's tech-savvy, can access whatever they want. And even for us, I mean, and for you too, Rory, I mean, I think we're all platform agnostic now. We produce content that sits on multiple platforms. It gets shared by, younger people on TikTok. Older people on YouTube will watch it. And then it's also on legacy platforms like satellite and linear television, terrestrial stations.
Sorry,
Yeah, please.
just wanted to ask, how are you educating the girls then? Is that through the internet?
No, we're using, everything we do is available everywhere. But the way we get into people's homes is through a television set, because 80% of households now have access to a TV set. And it's a single TV household. So it's a bit like your country was 30, 40 years ago. People gather around the television set. So we play these programs air usually in the mornings and are also in the afternoon. So we catch children, both boys and girls, because the education levels have dropped significantly. And we use the programs are very interesting, that we use Muppets and animation, and we work with the likes of NYU and Malala and others to create these really interesting programs where people can learn. And one piece of stat for you. So we've surveyed 2,500 kids, sort of a baseline, like no education, and then they watch these programs, and then some of them get tutored on WhatsApp. A group of girls get tutored on WhatsApp. So the kids who watch no television, they scored, let's say, 25% in their maths examination. The ones who watched television scored 55%. And the ones who were tutored via WhatsApp received 75%, achieved 75%. So it makes, the impact is dramatic, and UNICEF have told us that they haven't seen results like this before. So it's quite encouraging. It's not a substitute for school. Nothing is. But it's a sort of a Band-Aid solution till we get to a place where we can educate these girls.
Over here, yes, please. Yep.
Good evening, Kerry Edwards. I think I speak for everyone where it's an absolute privilege to be here with you two. I think it's absolutely superb. My question is, how useful do you think withholding funds to Afghanistan and restricting them from the international banking community, how helpful was that for the West?
It hasn't been effective. I mean, I think the two key things I have to, again, stress, existing policies have not worked. The Taliban have not changed their policies. If anything, they punish the people of the country. And two, the Taliban are here to stay, for now at least. And you saw that for yourself. So I think we need to reassess the way that we deal with Afghanistan. Engagement doesn't mean recognition. Engagement means just going there, speaking to them, basically ensuring that whether it's humanitarian assistance or education programs, that the world assistance continues. I mean, even now, the world puts a lot of money into Afghanistan. It's about $2 billion a year. So Afghanistan remains a large, one of the biggest recipients of international aid. That needs to continue. But I think they need to also, I think there is a receptive audience with some members of the Taliban in terms of dealing, in particular, with the Americans. And I think we shouldn't lose this opportunity.
So, yeah.
Thank you. I think you mentioned comedy as being part of your output, and I found that rather intriguing. Is there an element of self-censorship, or is there state censorship? Are you straying into satire, and can that be subversive, or where are the limits?
Well, I think they push the envelope when they can. But it's funny because our comedians have been arrested on a number of occasions. The intelligence guys seem to not have much, in terms of sense of humor. They're not really that open to humor. But it's funny, but some of the others really enjoy humor. Afghans in general are big fans of comedy. But yes, we have to self-censor. I think that.
What are the kinds of things they got arrested for? What are the gags which don't go down well with the security people?
I think the funny thing is that because the Taliban are paranoid, so you can be talking, it could be two shopkeepers arguing the price of vegetables, and they think that we're ridiculing the authorities, because in the old days what we used to do was, even during Karzai's time, initially, we couldn't target the president directly. So we created this fictitious king from, like, say, the 14th century, who was Karzai, and then his key people. And that way we could poke fun at the government and his key ministers, but it was like, it was meant to be a sort of a bit like Blackadder, right? Our version of Blackadder. And then later on, we became much more adventurous, and we had the real, guy looking like Karzai, giving speeches and twitching and, all the usual stuff that Karzai used to do. But so the Taliban are very paranoid. They watch every program, and they think that we're making fun of them, which in fact we may not be. But they do sometimes, yes.
Did you, during, the time when Saad was running this, before the Taliban came back, there were two presidents. There was Hamid Karzai and there was Ashraf Ghani. And you often criticized and teased and spoke up against both of them. Did you have moments when these guys were like, you've got to stop this? It's me or the Taliban. If you criticize me in any way, you're going to give credence to my enemies. You're going to bring the whole system down. Were you under a lot of pressure from
Yes,
them?
quite often. Well, in the book, there's one chapter about when they arrested a whole bunch of people from our office, because we went and met with the Taliban in 2005 or 2006, and the Taliban members were in Helmand in the south. This is before the insurgency had really taken off. This was sort of at the beginning. The Taliban were about to return. And these two individuals were sitting around, they had their faces covered, and they said, listen, we're just, we represent the local communities. We don't report to anyone. We don't have any links to people in Kuwait and Pakistan or the Taliban leadership. We just, the government officials, they prey on us, they're cruel, they steal from us, they, marry our women by force. And we're going to resist these people. And why is Karzai involved with these warlords? And they named names, and we aired the whole thing. And then Karzai, wanted me arrested, but my mistake, they arrested my brother and half a dozen other people. And then they were there.
Why did they arrest your brother, my mistake? What happened
because
there?
we look alike. No, they called me into the intelligence agency, and then, and my brother said, he's a lawyer. He said, well, and he's a hard-nosed sort of litigator. And he said, listen, I'm going to go and speak to them, not realizing he was going to get arrested. And apparently the story was that the guy came to question them, but my brother had the 22 volumes of media laws under his arm, and he started arguing with the guy. And then the guy basically ran off, and he told the intelligence chief later on that he had a headache for the next 3 days because my brother was just, talking nonstop. But then I met with Karzai, and I said to Karzai, I said, listen, and initially he, lectured me and abused me, and he said, how could you do this? You support the Taliban. I said, listen, but it's important to listen to these people because it tells you something about your government. And I even told him a little story about I don't know if you know the story, but Sir Laurence Olivier was shooting the film The Marathon Man, right? And then he came down in the lift, and the door's open. He's wearing his cravat, about to have breakfast. There's Dustin Hoffman, looking disheveled, smells, reeks of BO. He said, Dustin, where have you been? He said, I've been sleeping on a park bench. I said, why? He said, I want to get into the role. He said, Dustin, act, right? So I told Karzai, I said, Mr. Karzai, because he loved Hollywood, I said, govern, you know, and it infuriated him. But and I was with him for 4.5 hours that day, negotiating the release of these people. But there was a really important moment because I realized that he's oblivious to what his constituency demands, which is justice. So we had elections in Afghanistan, but we never had justice. The courts were corrupt, the bureaucracy was corrupt, the parliament was corrupt. The only thing that actually functioned relatively well was the media. You know.
So then the next guy that came in, after Karzai was the great hope for people like Richard Holbrooke and the Americans, a man called Ashraf Ghani. And Ashraf Ghani had been a professor, he'd worked at the World Bank, he had a huge brain, he wrote enormous numbers of books. And he came in saying he was going to be exactly the opposite of Karzai, and he'd worked out everything that was wrong with Karzai, and he was going to fix the whole thing, and we were going to have this wonderful state. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Ashraf Ghani is famous because he refers to Rory as a donkey.
Son of a donkey.
Son of a donkey,
Yes,
sorry,
son
son of a donkey.
Which is not very polite in Dari, I just explained.
It wasn't a compliment. I dealt with him when he was a finance minister, and I've got it in my book that he had a very, he was very thin-skinned, as you recall, and we did a whole series of stories about this taxation program, and he took it very personally and refused to talk to me, and threatened to kick me out of my own country, because he used to always threaten UN officials that I'm going to kick you out of Afghanistan. He made a similar threat to me in public, to kick me out of my own country, which I pointed out on the spot. But then I went to see him in Washington, and I said, Professor Ghani, I said, you have great attributes. You're highly intelligent. You love your country, but you have a short temper. And he said, and he had a very high-pitched voice, as you recall. He said, "No, I don't." And I said, "You do." He said, "No, I don't." I said, "You do." He said, "No, I don't." I said, "You do." And then he lost his temper, and he, basically struck the plate on the table, and it cracked in half with his boiled egg. And I said, "See?" He goes, "I did it on purpose," right? So he didn't have the temperament to lead the country. And when he won the elections, fraudulently, by the way, because we covered all the fraud and the stuffing of boxes, and we got the recording, the tapes of, telephone conversations between officials.
And he was helped, presumably, by the American government to do this.
I think he was helped by people within Karzai's team. Now, whether the Americans knew about it or not, but I went to the White House and said, "What the hell's going on?" They said, "We're not getting involved." They didn't care less. I think maybe they didn't have the bandwidth, but in some ways they understood, well, Ghani's going to be a better person for us. So he came in, and he didn't have the temperament. The guy didn't have the patience to, Afghanistan is a country where you have to spend hours and hours with people drinking endless cups of tea. There was a story about...
Which Karzai was better at.
Karzai was great at it. I mean, Karzai was not a good manager, but he was a great leader. There was one, Uruzgan, which was a very important province. So a key strongman died. His family came to see Ashraf Ghani. And then immediately he said, "You've only got 10 minutes. Right? 10 minutes. So they said, and they were so offended, they said, "We have nothing to say," they left. The next day, 120 villages fell to the Taliban. So, he wasn't suited for that position, and he was completely oblivious to what was going on around the country.
Well, one of the anecdotes that I've always thought which give a sense of his amazing realism and sense reality was you describing to him his inviting the Afghan Olympic sprinting team round to the palace. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, it's if you went to Ashraf Ghani and said, have you read about Albert Einstein? He'd tell you that he invented the atomic bomb. He did this. He had a habit, and you know this, right? That of anything, he would say he's done that. So, a bunch of athletes went to him, to get an award, and he said, "Did you know that I used to be the?" I got to do the. He said, I used to be the sprinting champion of Afghanistan. And people said, well, he said, I like to race you. So he took his shoes off, no sneakers, and
And he's now like sort of 60 years old. And
he's like 67.
Yeah.
So, I run, but even I wouldn't sprint. You need to get warmed up, and I'm in my 50s. So, and then they're watching him, and he says, "You have to race me." So they all, no one wants to beat him. It's a bit like playing golf against your boss in Japan.
or Donald Trump.
Oh, Donald Trump, yeah. And then apparently they started, and he was going for it. I mean, he was going to break the Olympic record. 50 meters in, he trips, and he does a sort of a somersault or two, and he just lands like this, and apparently all twisted up. And people were afraid to approach him just in case he was dead, and they get blamed for it. And then he was flown to Bagram Air Base, and then he was in I think he couldn't walk for like a year and a half or something. He was limping, or he had a cast and everything. It was a major surgery. You know the story, right?
That was amazing. And I remember sort of trying to get into the head of what happens if you're an 18-year-old Afghan Olympic sprinter turning up to meet the president and he challenges you to a race.
Yeah.
And how do you kind of get through? Okay, let's open up to another question, please.
We've got one at the back here.
Yes, please. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I can't see you. I'm behind the pillar. But I wonder, nowadays journalism doesn't necessarily follow the values, and the values of journalism has been under attack. But I wonder, how do you define balance under a authoritarian regime for your journalists?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, they make the rules, and they're the government. So, you have to obviously cover what they have to say. I think there are subtle ways of covering the other, let's just say, if the Taliban let's just give the example of education. They have the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, they have the Ministry of Education, they have the Ministry of Higher Education. Some of these individuals are very conservative, and they will obviously push the government narrative. So how do you balance that? So we have to work very hard to find people from within the system that can push back on this narrative. Because if we bring in, some PhD from the US who's of Afghan heritage, they're going to say, well, these are opposition members and they don't like the Taliban. You're trying to undermine the system. But if you bring someone from within the system, you're able to push back on that narrative and balance things out. So the job of a reporter is much more difficult in a place like Afghanistan, because you have to, they understand the sensitivities. And we don't have any safety nets. When we were there, when all those years ago, the international community was present. There were media laws. There was a constitution. I mean, the judiciary was weak, but still we had one. Today we have no safety nets. They can just put you behind bars. So the fact that these guys, my guys, the news guys, can manage and the news operations on a day-to-day basis, it's quite extraordinary.
No, where are we?
We've got one right back here,
Yep.
to your right. Right back here.
Hi there, good evening. I'm just wondering, what is the strength of these authoritarian regimes, especially in Iran and Afghanistan, if likes of yourselves and families and the people in your countries are putting so much both time, money, and energy into, I don't use the word educating, but into enlightening the youth, as well as those already established in your generation? What is that strength that the authoritarian regimes have over the people that holds them in their current position of power? Because my worry is that you put this energy into Afghanistan, who's relatively recently been formally taken over by Taliban. In 79, we had the revolution in Iran. All sorts of effort has gone in that country to no avail. Do we just have to wait for the likes of Khamenei to die, or what is the revolution that's going to happen, if any at all?
Well, what's interesting about Afghanistan is that the Taliban's approval rating never exceeded 15%, because we were polling Afghans nationally. It was higher in the south, for example, where the Taliban come from. It was like 30%. But nationally, it was at 15% maximum, between 10 and 15%. The government's approval rating was around 17 to 20%. So they were not that dissimilar, because it was a corrupt, inept government. It preyed on its own citizens. And people also felt a bit like the US. I mean, people kept on saying, well, look at the economy is doing well, billions of dollars coming into the country, but people didn't see much of that. Although the country in absolute terms changed a lot in those in the 2 decades after 9/11. So, but then it wasn't the. I mean, this is what people forget: is the people didn't bring back the Taliban. There was a vacuum left by the withdrawal of the Americans, and the transition went very badly. And you know, the Americans decided in April of 2021 to leave, and they're gone by end of August 2021. I mean, 4 months to pull out all those troops. But then when they left, when they decided to leave, the Afghan military was built in the mold of the US military, relying heavily on subcontractors. So as soon as they left, as soon as they announced they were leaving, all the contractors left that month. So the guys fixing the aircraft, the guys providing the fuel, the guys doing the catering, all these guys left. So all of a sudden the Afghan military, you know, they couldn't even fix their own aircraft or vehicles. So they were completely and totally exposed. And I think with Biden, the way he left Afghanistan, it's borderline criminal. I mean, I'm glad that they're doing this. And I know that it's a bit weird to support one of Trump's announcements, but one of the things he's announced is that they're going to investigate the Afghan withdrawal. And I think it's fair for them to do that because it was highly irresponsible the way he did it.
Yeah, we've got one back here.
Great. I think we're coming towards the end, so let's take one last question and then one last from me. Where are we?
Right back here.
Okay.
On your left.
Ask away. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. And Fred, back there for that.
Okay. Hi. Thank you both for this. This is extremely insightful. My question is, there seems to be a paradox between this Taliban 2.0 in what they do in theory and what they do in practice. And so we've got, as you said, Rory, a powerful regime in the Taliban, but then you also have a liberal, progressive media organization. So why haven't you been closed down yet? What have they got to lose to shut you down, I guess? That's my question. Thank you.
I think some of them generally believe they're of the people, for the people. So they think media is important to, you know, criticize or scrutinize things to entertain people. They understand population of 43 million people, you know, they don't have cafes or the opera or the theater to go to, and television is sort of the main source of entertainment. But I think the other important thing is that you know, we talked about this before, it's not a monolithic movement, lots of different leaders within the movement itself. If they shut down all the media outlets, there's only one left, which is the state broadcaster, and they will carry the voice of only one individual in Kandahar, who's the leader. So all the other leaders will be deprived of other means of getting their messages out to people. You know, they've become, even during when the Americans were there, the Taliban were actually quite media savvy, but they've become even better at it. They've got like multiple spokespeople. They always have an entourage of, you know, journalists going with them to the provinces. They understand the power of the media, and they know that they have to win hearts and minds, especially the younger generation, the leaders in their 30s and 40s. But again, I wouldn't take, you know, I mean, we're there for now. I mean, tomorrow you cannot, you know, I can't predict anything in terms of what they do tomorrow.
Do you have a sense of how media works in Russia? You definitely have a sense of how media works in Iran. What would the contrast be with how a television station would operate in Russia or Iran compared to Afghanistan?
Well, in Iran, in terms of television, there is no private media. They have platforms like Netflix-type platforms where people can download videos, but the 7 networks, you know, operated by the IRIB, are all state media outlets.
And my memory of them is it's pretty boring. You get a lot of music, a lot of beautiful waterfalls and nature shots and stuff.
No, you get drama series, but they're not fun. I mean, they're like, you know, there's, you know, people. I mean, Turkish series is about, you know, the guy having an affair with his niece's girlfriend and all sorts of things like that. But, and, you know, the content that we put out, because we buy a lot of Turkish content, it's very spicy, very interesting. Iranian content is very boring, of course, and that's why no one watches television in Iran. So a lot of people go via satellite, which is what we started in 2008 to reach Iranian households. And we initially started dubbing South American telenovelas. And
tell us a little bit about that. I don't think everyone knows.
Well, I mean, we launched this channel called Farsi One. I think in 2007. Most Iranians had a satellite dish, but they were not getting any content. We thought, why not take content from the West, dub it into Persian, and then, you know, just go via satellite. And it became hugely popular. As a matter of fact, I mean, we had this show called Victoria, this older Colombian woman, you know, the husband's cheating on her, And then she does the same thing, and she goes and finds a young boyfriend. And then it became a term in Iran to do a Victoria, for example, right? So that was our contribution to Iran. But it was a hugely popular network in Iran. And now Iranians have access to news, entertainment, music, and so forth, all going in via satellite. The Russians have always had free media, quote unquote. Entertainment is not an issue in Russia, but news is, of course, an issue. But, you know, I mean, they're dictatorial in different ways.
And China?
I don't know much about China. I mean, obviously, there's a lot available online. I'm not sure if people can get around. In Iran, of course, VPNs are huge.
And I think in China, the sort of digital Great Wall is much stronger. It's much more difficult to
But even in Pakistan, someone was telling me that they're finding ways to disrupt people's, you know, if they're using VPNs.
To try to stop. There was a question here. Yeah, please. Yeah. Yes, microphone coming, yeah.
Hello. As an Afghan and just a former Taliban, Mohseni, I'm really thankful for all your services for Afghanistan. You've mentioned earlier about this intra-Taliban conflicts. Nowadays, there are rumors circulating that the Haqqanis are becoming more and more kind of moderate, and they are in disagreement with Kandahari strict interpretations or their draconian laws there. I was just wondering how accurate it is. There are some speculation that the conflict is inevitable between these two groups. And if a conflict occurs, then what would be its consequences for Afghanistan? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And then just a little background again for people who aren't following the day-to-day. So the Haqqani network was a largely Pakistan-based network associated with a very, very large number of terror attacks in Afghanistan, including on friends of mine. And the paradox that seems to have emerged since the return of the Taliban and the Haqqanis taking key positions in the ministries is that they have suddenly been revealed, it seems, in some ways, socially more liberal, more progressive than other parts of the Taliban setup. So you have this paradox of a group which was very much associated in people's minds with terrorist acts, suicide attacks, bombing, now being associated with more progressive attitudes towards female education and other things. On which over to you.
Yeah, it's an important question. I think they're very careful. They understand to challenge too soon would fragment the group. It'll be the beginning of the end for them, like we've seen with so many other groups in the the Mujahideen in the 90s and so forth. I think they're very strategic, and they have a long runway in terms of they don't want to. They're in no hurry, but they also understand that the situation, may not be conducive to do something if they wait too long. They're not going to rush into anything, but I think if there's an opportunity, I think they will make their move. Yes, the New York Times profile of Sirajuddin Haqqani is worth a read for those of you who are interested. They're pragmatic, they're not as ideological, but they're still, they believe in the sort of the hardcore interpretation of Islam. But I think that they will, for example, on girls' education, they're much more receptive. They believe in freedom of expression. As a matter of fact, a man was condemned to die, and Sirajuddin Haqqani went personally, begged the family to let him live because a family can forgive. They refused to do so, but he went and he tried. So I think it's part of the PR effort to show that he's the most pragmatic, most moderate man. I mean, we lost 7 of our employees. A bus of ours was targeted, and the perpetrators were members of the Haqqani network. But in Afghanistan, this is a reality that we have to all accept, because we've all have lost friends, relatives, colleagues. And I had a discussion with one of their members, and I told him, I said, this is what happened to our colleagues. And he also mentioned what had happened to his brothers and cousins, and 30 or 40 members of his immediate family had been killed by the Americans and the Afghans. So if we want to move forward, we have to let bygones be bygones and learn from those lessons.
Okay, I'm going to give you a choice for the last question. Okay. either we can go quite serious and you can tell us about your thoughts on Gaza and the Middle East, or go another direction, you can tell us about your meeting with Elon Musk, your 4.5 hours with Elon Musk. What would you like to finish with?
How about both?
Do both. Tell us about both. Go.
Well, Gaza, I think Gaza is perhaps the most. I mean, I've seen everything. I mean, given my age, and given my father's position, Iranian Revolution, '79, seizure of the mosque in Mecca, which radicalized Islam, especially Islam that came out of Saudi, the invasion of Afghanistan, and so forth in the Middle East, in our region. I think Gaza is the most consequential event of my lifetime. And you will see the consequences of what's happening in Gaza, if not tomorrow, if not in 5 years, in 10 years, you will. I point out to Iran, Mossadegh was replaced in the 1950s by the CIA. The Iranian Revolution happened 2 decades later. And to this day, they talk about Mossadegh and the way that he was toppled by the CIA. So this Gaza thing is not going away. It'll have an impact across the Middle East and globally, I think. And there are governments in the Middle East who are vulnerable. The local populations see the impotence of their leaders, and there's a great deal of anger. We're launching an Arabic platform for the Gen Zs. We're doing a lot of research. 97 or 98% of young Saudis that we interviewed cared about Gaza, what was going on. Not about rave parties, not about J-Lo performing, not about, the freedoms that they currently enjoy, relative freedom. So this is a really important issue, and I think that it's one to bear in mind.
Can I just develop that then one more? So the rulers in Saudi, to some extent, and certainly the rulers in UAE, have been much more muted of their criticism than you would have expected 20, 30 years ago. And 20, 30 years ago, you would have said that's quite dangerous for them, because their people will feel immense sympathy and will be very angry with their rulers for creating these kinds of relationships.
Well, the UAE is fine because the local population only represents 20% of the total population. I think there are only 2 million Emiratis in a country of 10 million people. Saudi is much more vulnerable, especially if they can't deliver on their economic goals, jobs for these young people. And I think the discussions in people's homes are very different to what you may hear on television. So under the surface, there's a great deal of anger, whether it's in Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia and beyond, in the Islamic world and the global south. But I think in the Islamic world, certainly this is very serious. So I think it's one to keep an eye on. In terms of, I was telling Rory that I met a friend of mine had his boat out like 12 years ago. And I went, and there was 6 people there, and there was a guy, and I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I make electric cars." And I said, "What's the company called?" He said, "Tesla." And I said, "Oh," and he had his ex-wife who was dating him again or something, some weird arrangement, and they were holding hands, and they were very affectionate towards each other. And I was stuck with him for 4.5 hours, and then by the end I was like, "Get me out of here! When are we going to talk so I can get away from this guy?" And then a week later, my brother said, "This company Tesla, it's an interesting company." I said, "Listen, I met the guy. He's a weirdo. Don't ever buy the stock."
It's good. It's good. It's good to admit. Occasionally you get things wrong.
I've been trying to meet him since, but...
Thank you. Well, guys, listen, it's been such a pleasure. We've been in so many different directions, from the very, very serious to the very detailed, to the comical, to the moving. I feel very proud to know Saad. I think he's an extraordinary example of somebody who represents Gramsci's ideal of the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. What he's doing in Afghanistan is about compromise and about ideals, and it's about balancing something very difficult. It'd be very easy for him to simply walk away and say, "This is too difficult, I don't want to be criticized for doing anything on the Taliban." It would be equally easy for him simply to fold and become just a propaganda entertainment machine. Instead of which, he's continuing to try to fight for something which I think really matters in the world. And he remains, I think, one of the most interesting people that we have around. So I would encourage you all, if you haven't done so, to buy his book, which I believe we have some books here at the back. Is that right? Yeah. And he will be signing those books. So thank you all very, very much indeed for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening as much as I did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.